Miss Marple and the cottage garden that hid a grave. Welcome back, dear friends. How lovely it is to have you with us again here at Marple Files. I'm Walter, and I'll be your companion for the next few hours as the light goes and the house grows quiet. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let the words carry you gently away. Tonight we travel down to Somerset, to a village called Nether Bewley, in the driest summer anyone there can remember. The brook has gone to green puddles. There is a standpipe on the green and a queue beside it every morning at 6. And along the south wall of a low white cottage called Wren's Peace, there runs the finest garden in the county. 30 yards of it, all white, photographed twice for the gardening papers. Miss Marple notices only one thing about it. 2/3 of the way along, between the buttress and the door in the wall, there is a patch of ground 1.5 yards across, where the flowers have died 3 weeks before their neighbours. Not faded, not withered at the edges, the way drought damage goes. It has corners, and in a village where a girl once went away to Canada 30 years ago, and everyone knows it, and no one has ever seen a letter from her they read with their own eyes, a rectangle of dying flowers is a very dangerous thing for an old lady to notice. Stay with me. The first spade goes into that ground before the summer ends. Chapter 1. The association had judged Nether Bewley on the 4th Saturday in August for 31 years, and in all that time, Honoria Ledgard said, they had never once had to judge it dry. Not dry like this. 1921, and even then the brook ran. She had the window down and her elbow out of it, and the hedgerow going past was the colour of a paper bag. You'll want to allow for it, Jane. In your mind, everything will look a fortnight further on than it ought. I shall allow for it, Miss Marple said. She was holding the clipboard, which was the entire reason she had been brought, and she held it the way she had held a great many things in her life that were not what they appeared to be. On the top sheet, the classes were printed in violet ink. Herbaceous border, cottage. Herbaceous border, formal. Vegetable plot under 6 perches, single specimen rose. Beneath the printing, in Honoria's hand, 4 names had been penciled, and 3 of them crossed out again. The village came up out of the heat without any particular ceremony. There was a wall, and then houses, and then a triangle of grass by the pump where a standpipe had been fitted, and a queue of 11 women stood with buckets in the full sun, none of them talking, all of them looking at the car. 2 hours in the morning, Honoria said, and 2 at 6. The waterboard man came out from Wells on Thursdays and said the same thing every week in a slightly different order. They began at the vicarage, which had a rose that was not going to win, and were given lemonade by a woman who watched them drink it as though she had made a considerable calculation about how much of it to make. The Reverend Aubrey Nance came out in shirt sleeves and shook hands and said that he had prayed for rain in July and had not repeated it. One doesn't like to appear importunate, he said. One doesn't like to appear ignored, said Honoria. He laughed, and then stopped laughing very slightly before the laugh was finished, and went back in for his jacket. At the schoolhouse, Miss Charlotte Bream had a boarder in the formal class, and a great deal to say about it. She was 39, and dressed 8 years younger, and she used the Latin the way people use a foreign language they have learned entirely from books, with the stresses in confident wrong places. She told them about the drainage she had put in, and about her plans for the far end, and about how a delphinium wanted feeding, and while she talked her eyes went, 4 separate times, to the gap in her own planting, where something had recently been lifted and the soil turned back over. She did not mention it. Miss Marple wrote, formal, C. Bream on the clipboard and, in the margin, nothing at all. She'll want the cup this year, Honoria said in the lane afterwards. She's wanted it since she came. Has she any hope of it? None whatsoever, and she knows it, and she'll be perfectly charming about it on the day. Honoria stopped to shift her stick to the other hand. That's the thing about Charlotte. Nobody can find a single fault with the way she loses. They did the vegetable plots after 11, when the shade had gone off everything, and the men who had grown them stood at the ends of their own rows with their arms folded, saying that it had been a poor year, waiting to be contradicted. A young man was up a ladder against a shed with a bow saw across his shoulder, and he came down when he saw them and said, "Morning, Miss Ledgard," and Honoria said, "Percy," and that was the whole of it. His name was Tap. He did work for 6 or 7 of the gardens they had already seen, and he had a bicycle propped against the wall that was newer than anything else about him. Wren's piece was last, because it was always last, because there was no point in looking at the others afterwards. It stood a little out of the village on the Shard Road, a low house with the render gone chalky, and the border ran the whole length of the south wall, 30-odd yards of it, white, entirely white, and it had been photographed twice for the gardening papers. Miss Marple stopped at the gate for a moment longer than she needed to. In the heat coming up off the path, the whole thing swam very slightly, and the effect was not of a garden at all, but of something poured out along the foot of the wall and left to set. "Now," said Honoria with satisfaction, "now you'll see." Miss Dorothea Ilsley came round the end of the house with a can in each hand and put them down without hurrying. She was 66 and built like a fence post, and she had the flat, entirely unembarrassed courtesy of a woman who has been in a great many bedrooms at 4 in the morning. She said good morning, and that she had been told Miss Marple was coming, and that there was tea if they wanted it, and the well was low, so perhaps they didn't. "We'll look first," said Honoria. They went along it slowly. Phlox and campanula, and the tall white foxgloves that had gone to seed at the top and were still opening at the bottom, and a smell coming off all of it in the heat that was heavy and slightly funereal. Honoria put her face down to a phlox at the near end, quite close, and breathed in. "Mia ruis," she said. "Frau Alfred von Mauthner," said Dorothea Ilsley. "Is it? It has been for 9 years." Honoria straightened up and said that the nose went before the eye did, and laughed at herself, and moved on. Miss Marple, who had been standing a yard behind and slightly to one side, wrote nothing on the clipboard about that either. It was 2/3 of the way along, between the second buttress and the door in the wall, that the border stopped. Not stopped. Miss Marple looked at it for some time, before she found a word she was satisfied with, and the word was not stopped. For about 1.5 yards in a stretch you could have covered with a hearthrug, the phlox had gone over. The flowers had browned at the edges and dropped. The leaves had crisped from the bottom up, and the whole patch stood a half-shade paler and 3 inches shorter than everything either side of it. On the left, perfect. On the right, perfect. And between them this rectangle, and it was a rectangle. That was the thing. It did not fade out at the edges the way drought damage fades. It had corners, of plants 3 weeks further into the year than their neighbours. Behind her, Honoria was saying something about the campanula. Miss Marple stepped a little closer. The soil in the pale stretch had cracked differently, in wider, shallower cracks, and where she put the toe of her shoe against it, the crust broke and went to dust with almost no pressure at all, and the dust was a lighter colour than the dust on either side. "Miss Ilsley," she said, "what has happened just here?" The watering cans were still where they had been put down. Dorothea Ilsley did not come over to look, which was interesting, because everybody who is asked a question about their own garden comes over to look. She stood where she was with her hands loose at her sides, and she looked at the pale patch for rather longer than the question had cost her, and then she looked at the wall above it. "Old drainage," she said. Miss Marple waited. "You'll want to see the lime," said Dorothea Ilsley. "I've had it 4 years running off the same man at Cheddar, and I've stopped, and I'll tell you why, and Honoria won't like it." She picked up the cans and started for the far end, and Honoria, who was already asking about the lime, went after her, and Miss Marple stood a moment longer with the clipboard held against her chest, looking at 1.5 yards of ground where something, once, a long time ago, had been dug. She came back on the Tuesday, alone, on the pretext of the lime. It was a poor pretext, and Dorothea Ilsley did not trouble to pretend otherwise. She opened the door with her sleeves pushed up, and said that the man at Cheddar had been giving them all ground limestone, and calling it lime and charging for lime, and that Honoria had known it for 2 years and said nothing, because his wife did the association's teas. Then she said there was tea, and that the well had come up 1 inch on Sunday, and she went ahead into the kitchen without waiting to see whether Miss Marple followed. The kitchen was cool in the way that only a flagged north room in a drought can be cool. There was a dresser along one wall, and on it a decanter with a ground stopper, 3/4 full of something the colour of weak tea with a sediment lying in the bottom of it, and a small glass upside down beside it on a folded cloth. There was a jar of raffia. There were seed catalogues in a pile squared off at the corners, and a tin box, and above the range a nurse's certificate in a black frame, dated 1912, hanging slightly askew, and clearly having hung slightly askew for a very long time. Mrs. Ivy Kingswell was at the sink with her hat still on. "This is Miss Marple," said Dorothea Ilsley. "She's come about the lime and she hasn't." "Ah," said Mrs. Kingswell, entirely satisfied, and turned the tap, which coughed and gave her about a cupful, and stopped. They had tea at the scrubbed table. Dorothea Ilsley talked about ground limestone for 6 or 7 minutes, with a precision that suggested she had been storing it up for somebody who would understand it, and then about the man at Cheddar, and then about the man at Cheddar's brother, who kept the pigs and was another matter altogether. Her hands were very bad, the knuckles gone thick and the nails cut down to nothing, and she did not look at them or spare them. She poured, she drank, and when her cup was empty, she got up in the middle of her own sentence, carried it to the sink, rinsed it under the 2 seconds of water the tap would give her, and set it face down on the wooden board beside the sink, and came back, and sat down, and finished the sentence. She did it with the milk jug when the milk was done. She did it with the spoon. Miss Marple, who had been finding people out for a very long time, sat with her own cup between her hands, and let it go cold. "You've had that a while," she said, when the sentence about the pigs had reached its end. She was looking at the certificate. 43 years, 31 of them here. Dorothea Ilsley did not look at it. "There's nobody in this village over 40 I haven't had my hands on, one way or the other. Some of them mind it." "Do they say so?" "They don't come to the gate," she said, "which is saying so." Mrs. Kingswell said, from the sink, that Mrs. Prescott had never come to the gate, not once, not since her mother, and everyone knew why, and Dorothea Ilsley said, "That'll do, Ivy," without any weight in it at all, and Mrs. Kingswell said, "Ah," and went on with the plates. She had a way of talking about the village that was not gossip. It was more like an inventory taken by somebody who has been left in charge of a building, who was ill, who would be ill, which of the taps had the chest. She never named a fault, and she never named a virtue, and by 4:20, Miss Marple had a very clear picture of a woman who knew everything about everyone, and had spent 40 years discovering that it did not make her fond of them. "You've the catalogues out," Miss Marple said, "in August. They want ordering in August or you get what's left." Dorothea Ilsley pulled the top one towards her without any particular interest, and let it fall open at a page that had plainly been opened before. "Lincolnshire have put tulips up again, 14 and 6 the 100 for a thing that was 11 and 3 before the war. And it's the same bulb, and they know it's the same bulb. And will you have them?" "I've had them," she said. 200. Postal order went off last Tuesday. I shall be very disagreeable about it until the spring, and then I shall forget." Mrs. Kingswell put the plates on the board face down, one against the other, in a row, and dried her hands, and said she'd be off then, and would there be Thursday as usual. Thursday as usual. The door went. Through the window, the heat came up off the path in a way that made the gate-post seem to move slightly, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable while. Then Dorothea Ilsley said, "The apple's dead." Miss Marple turned her head. "The pippin at the end. It's been going 3 years and it's gone now. There's not a leaf on it. Percy Tapp's coming Friday week to have it out." She was looking at the window and not at anything through it. Her hands had come together on the table, one holding the other by the thumb, and they were quite still, and they had not been still all afternoon. "The roots'll be under half that border. He'll have to dig it. There's no other way to have a tree out." "That will be a great deal of damage," said Miss Marple. "Yes," said Dorothea Ilsley. She said it the way people say a date they have been waiting for since before the war. Miss Marple heard the tone perfectly clearly and could make nothing whatever of it, and she was still turning it over on the walk back down the Shard Road, past the pump, where the 6 o'clock queue had already begun to form. Friday week was the 11th, and the 11th was the hottest day of the whole summer, and Miss Marple was not there when it happened. She heard it at the pump at 6:30, from a woman she had never spoken to, who told her the way people tell strangers a thing, completely and out of order and with the wrong parts emphasized. The tree had come out at 11. Percy Tapp had got a chain round the stump and Bassett's tractor on the other end of the chain, and the root plate had come up whole and turned over on its side like a lifted flagstone, and there had been a smell that was not a root smell, and Percy Tapp had gone down on his knees in the compost and been sick, and had then gone on being sick after there was nothing to be sick with, which the woman at the pump reported with considerable relish and no cruelty at all. Miss Marple went up the charred road with her bucket still in her hand. There were perhaps 40 people at the wall. That was the first thing, and it was a Friday, and they should have been at work, and no one had come to move them on. The gate was shut, and a constable was standing inside it with his back to them, and beyond him, the border had been trampled at one end into a mash of white petals and dust, and the tree lay over on its side, with its roots in the air, enormous, obscene, still holding 100 weight of dry soil in the fork of them, like something clutched. Under where it had stood there was a hole and 2 men in the hole, and a tarpaulin folded ready on the grass, which meant they had sent for one. "Ribston Pippin," said a man beside her, to nobody. "Once a pollinator, she never had one, never fruited above a peck in her life." "It'll be Alice Verrill," said a woman on his other side. It took, Miss Marple thought afterwards, about 20 minutes. She stood at the wall in the flat evening heat with the bucket at her feet, and she heard it assembled, from 4 separate mouths, by people who were not talking to one another and did not need to be, that it would be Alice Verrill, who had gone off in 1925, that she had gone off with the photographer, the one who came round for the confirmations, the one with the tripod, Prowl his name was, or Prowl, that they had gone to Canada, the both of them, and there had been letters, and that everybody had always said, and here the 4th voice, an old one, with real feeling in it, that a girl like that never got so far as Canada. Nobody argued with any of it. Nobody said but there were letters, and then stopped, because the letters and the not getting to Canada were being held in the same hands at the same time without the smallest discomfort, and that was the part Miss Marple stood very still for. A village will believe 2 opposite things for 30 years quite comfortably. It only becomes difficult when somebody digs. Mrs. Kingswell arrived at 20 to 7, having come from the far end and heard it 3 times on the way. "They've had a sheet over," she said. "I saw them carry it as far as the shed, and then the doctor come. That's Dr. Quorn. He's not been here 6 year." She was breathing hard and her hat was crooked, and she was, quite evidently, having the best evening she had had since coronation year, and she was ashamed of it, and it was making her talk faster. And Percy Tapp took bad. Well, he would. He found it. He found it, and he's not been right since Thursday neither, so it's no wonder. Mrs. Kingswell shifted the basket on her arm, stood 4 rounds at the bell on Thursday, and him that never stands one. And he's been into Chard and settled with the bicycle shop, and that was £7 if it were a farthing. And where's a young man like that come by £7 in August? I'd like to know. Perhaps he was paid for something. He were paid for taking a tree out, said Mrs. Kingswell, and that were Friday, and this were Thursday, and she said it with such flat triumph that it was clear she had already had the argument with somebody and won. Miss Marple said nothing. Beyond the gate, one of the men in the hole had come up out of it and was standing with his hands on his hips looking down, and he did not look like a man who has finished. He looked like a man who is deciding whether to go on being paid for daylight. At 7, a car came up from the direction of Wells, and a man got out of it who was in his 40s and wearing a collar that was too warm for the day and had not been loosened, and he did not look at the crowd, which was itself a kind of looking. Miss Marple learned in about 90 seconds that this was Inspector Slack. He went through the gate, and he was in the hole within a minute, actually in it, up to his thighs, and she heard him say something short to the constable, and saw the constable begin at once to move people back off the wall with the flat of his hand, and the crowd went back 4 feet and stopped and stayed. It was while they were going back that the gate at the far end of the wall, the field gate, the one off the lane, opened, and a man came through it who had not come with the crowd. He was old, 70 or thereabouts, in a waistcoat with no jacket, and he had come across the stubble field and not up the road, which meant he had been fetched, or had heard, and had not gone round. He came on towards the hole at a pace that was not quite steady, and the constable turned and put a hand up and said something. The old man had already stopped. He was 10 feet short of the tarpaulin, and he was looking not at it but at the hole, at the shape of it, at the raw sides where the spades had cut down through the pale seam of disturbed ground, and his mouth was moving slightly before anything came out of it. "That's not her," he said. The constable said something else and put a hand on his arm. "That's not her," said Ambrose Verrill, louder, to the whole wall, to 40 people. "You needn't stand there. That's not my sister." The post office opened at 9, and by 10 past there were 11 people in it, which was 4 more than it held. Mrs. Verena Pike served them in order, and did not hurry, and did not once mention the tree. She was 58, neat as a folded letter, and she called every one of them by the whole of their name. "Good morning, Thomas Bassett, and how is your mother, Winifred Coles?" So that each transaction had the small, formal weight of something being entered somewhere. She weighed a parcel for the schoolmistress. She counted out a pension in coins, and slid it across, and waited, with her hands flat on the counter, until it had been counted back. Miss Marple bought stamps she did not need, and stood aside to be last. "Miss Jane Marple," said Mrs. Pike, when the door had shut on the second to last of them, "you're stopping with Miss Ledgard. Until the flower show. The show will be poor this year. Everything's a fortnight on." She took the shilling and rang it, and gave the change with the coins the right way up. "You'll have been at the wall last night." "I was. Everybody was." She said it without any judgment whatever, which was itself a considerable feat. "And they'd all got poor Alice buried and dug up again before the doctor come. You knew her. I sold her the stamps she wrote home on." Mrs. Pike turned and put the stamp book back on its shelf, square, next to the others. 13 year of them, near enough, and then it come quarterly instead, when the aunt's money was settled. "There's not many left in this village had a letter from her. There's me, and there's her brother. He does not think it is her. He does not." A very small pause, the length of a thing being decided against. "Well, Ambrose Verrill's had 30 year of saying she went to Canada, and now he's got to go on saying it, hasn't he? And I don't grudge him. I've read them out to him often enough. He never had his glasses when it come to it. He'd stand there with the envelope in his hand and hold it out to me over the counter, and I'd read it out to him, and there'd be others in the shop and they'd hear it too. It was a kindness. He couldn't have gone home not knowing till his wife come in. Every letter, every one," said Mrs. Pike, "for 30 year." And she said it with the modest satisfaction of a woman recording long service, and turned to the pigeonholes and began to sort what had come in on the van. Dorothea Ilsley came in at 20 past. She had not been seen since the Friday. She looked exactly as she had looked in her own kitchen, and she came to the counter and asked for a postal order for 4 and 6, and Mrs. Pike wrote it out and stamped it, and neither of them said anything about anything, and it was the most conspicuous silence Miss Marple had heard in some years. Then Dorothea Ilsley turned round in the doorway with the order in her hand, and saw Miss Marple and stopped. 14 and 6 the 100, she said. "I told you, and they'll be small. Have you had them? They'll come in October." She was standing with the light behind her, so that her face was not readable at all. "I shall put them along the front where the phlox is finished, because there'll be nothing there now till spring in any case." "No," said Miss Marple, "there will not." Dorothea Ilsley looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Good morning, Miss Marple," and went out, and the bell over the door was still going, when a voice behind Miss Marple said, quite pleasantly, that some people had a nerve. That was in the shop. The other thing happened in the bell, that evening, and Miss Marple was there for it, because Honoria Ledgard had a nephew who liked to be taken out for a chop. The bar was full and hot, and the door propped with a fire bucket. Ambrose Verrill was at the end of the settle with a pint he had not touched in 20 minutes, and 3 men round him not saying anything, and when Dorothea Ilsley came in, and there was no reason on earth for Dorothea Ilsley to come into the bell, and everybody in the room understood that at once, he got up. He got up slowly, which was worse. 30 year, he said, "Ambrose. 30 year I've been up and down this village, and you've said good morning to me. Sit down. You knew what you'd got in that garden." His voice had gone up, and he had a hand out, not pointing, open, as though he were showing her something on his palm. "You knew what you'd got in it every day of it. You had me stand at that gate at Christmas, and take a bough off that tree for my wife's table. You did not," said Dorothea Ilsley. "It never fruited. It never had a bough worth taking. You are thinking of the Blenheim at the Bassetts, and you have thought of it for 30 years. Somebody laughed, once, and stopped. "You know what's in it," said Ambrose Verrill. "I know what is not in it," she said, "and so do you. And you have known since the Friday, and you have not slept since, and it is not on my account." There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Then he sat down, all at once, the way a man sits when his legs have been waiting for permission, and Dorothea Ilsley bought a bottle of stout she did not want, and carried it out through the door past the fire bucket, and the room came back up to noise behind her, like water closing. 11 people saw it. Miss Marple asked 5 of them, over the following days, in a mild and roundabout way, what the quarrel had been about, and one said money, and one said the tree, and one said there had been bad blood since the mother, and Honoria's nephew, who had been nearest, said he supposed it was the girl. Not one of them could tell her what either of them had actually said. The association scrapbooks were kept at the schoolhouse because Charlotte Bream was secretary, and Charlotte Bream was delighted to produce them. There were 9, in cloth boards, going back to 1908, and she brought them out 2 at a time and laid them on the desks and stood over them turning the pages herself, which was not what Miss Marple had wanted and had been entirely predictable. She talked while she turned. She talked about the show and about the cup and about how the classes wanted reorganizing, and she said, twice, that of course the standard in the village had been carried for years by one garden and one garden only, in a voice that had a fine wire of something running through it. "You will miss her border," said Miss Marple. "We shall all miss it. It can never be got back, you know, not what it was. 20 years of feeding, and they've had a tractor across it." Charlotte Bream turned a page. One propagates what one can, of course, bits and pieces. Somebody has to think about the future of a collection. Does one take cuttings from another person's garden? "One takes cuttings," said Charlotte Bream, "where cuttings are to be had," and turned another page rather briskly, and there was 1925. It was mostly photographs. A row of men behind a trestle of onions. The band. A group outside the bell with the vicar of that time in the middle, and in the corner of the frame, half out of it, a young man in shirt sleeves, bending over a tripod, with his back to the camera, and his face not visible at all. And on the facing page, pasted at a slight angle, a postcard. It was a view of the Cheddar Road, and it had been written on the back in a round, forward-leaning hand, and pasted so that the writing showed. It was addressed to the association, and it said that Alice Verrall was very sorry, but she could not do the teas on the Wednesday as she had thought, and would Miss Coles ask Ruby, and that she would come down after and help clear. "Poor creature," said Charlotte Bream comfortably. She could not spell the day. They none of them could. "You've no idea what came out of that school before the war." She had already turned the page. "Now, 1927, that's the year the Marquis went over." Miss Marple came back to it, later, when Charlotte Bream had gone to see about the key, and stood with the book open and looked at the postcard for rather a long time. Wednesday, written without hesitation, in the middle of a sentence, by somebody who had never once been told otherwise, and had gone on for 22 years without finding out. She did not write it down. She had never in her life needed to write that kind of thing down. The vicar walked back with her as far as the vicarage gate, and asked her in, and gave her a glass of the lemonade, and talked about the drought, and then said, in a voice with all the ease taken out of it, "They have not found the other one." "The other one?" "The photographer, Proll." He set his glass down on the wall. "I have looked at the registers for that summer. It is what one does. He was not a parishioner, of course. He was nobody's parishioner. He went where the work was. But a man like that is written down somewhere, and I cannot find that he is written down anywhere at all after August of that year." "You looked before this week." The Reverend Aubrey Nance did not answer that immediately. "There is a notebook," he said at last. "It is not a scandalous thing, whatever anyone might make of it. Things are said to a clergyman that are not said under any seal. In a lane, at a gate, at the end of a christening when everyone has had a glass, and they are the true history of a parish, and they are lost within a generation because nobody writes them down. So I write them down. My predecessor did the same and left me his." "And your predecessor wrote down something about that summer." "He wrote down a great many things about that summer." He picked up his glass again. "I would rather not discuss it while the police are digging in a garden. You will think that cowardly." "I think it careful," said Miss Marple. "They are not the same, but they are neighbours." She walked back to Honoria's along the charred road in the last of the light, and the ground under the hedge was still giving up its heat, and she thought about a woman who had rinsed and inverted a milk jug in the middle of a sentence, and about 43 years of other people's bedrooms, and about a tree planted over a piece of ground that would never fruit because nobody had thought to give it a pollinator, because nobody had planted it for apples. She said it out loud to Honoria after dinner, on the terrace, with the moths coming at the lamp. I think she did not hide it, she said. I think she kept it. Kept it. There was a woman at home, Emily Farrar, at the home farm. Her sister died and she went on brushing the sisters' coats and airing them and hanging them back. For 11 years, and everybody said, poor Emily has gone. She had not gone anywhere. She was perfectly sane and rather hard. She simply understood that if she stopped, it would mean that she agreed to what had happened. Miss Marple turned her glass slowly on the arm of the chair. You do not grow the finest border in the county over a thing you want forgotten. You grow a hedge over it, or a shed. That garden has been photographed twice. Honoria was quiet for a moment. Then she buried him. Somebody buried him 2 feet deeper than a frightened person digs, said Miss Marple. A district nurse would know how deep, and a district nurse would know what a doctor writes down when nobody has asked him to look. And when they come to her, Jane, because they will come to her, they are 3 days off it. Yes, said Miss Marple, I have been thinking about that. They went in at 10 because the moths were unbearable. It was a Saturday. She was found at 7:20 on the Sunday morning by Ivy Kingswell, who did not do Sundays and had come up with a marrow. The doctor was there by 8 and gone by 9:10. Miss Marple heard the whole of it in the churchyard before matins, which was where the village had gone instead of the wall, and it was told in the same complete, out-of-order way, with the wrong parts emphasized. That she had been in the chair by the window, that the tin was on the shed shelf with the cap off it, the nicotine wash, XL all, the same as everybody had, the same as was in every potting shed in Somerset, that the glass was on the table beside her, with an inch left in it, and the decanter beside the glass. That Dr. Quorn had been in the house 11 minutes, and had written coronary occlusion, and had then, after a conversation on the step that 2 people had overheard, and neither could repeat, gone back in and written something else. He was standing at the lich gate when Miss Marple came out, and he explained it to her twice. There will have to be an inquest, he said. That is all it means. It does not mean anything more than that. A woman of that age, in this heat, and no history I could point to, well, no history I had had occasion to look for, she was not a patient who came. She was not a patient at all, really. He stopped, and began again more simply. It means an inquest, and an inquest means a post-mortem, and that is proper, that is all, it is entirely proper. You have signed a great many certificates in this parish, said Miss Marple. Not so many, said Dr. Quorn, and looked at the gravel. By Sunday evening, the village had it finished. She had done it in 1925, and she had grown that border over it for 30 years, and the day the tree came out she was a dead woman, and she had taken a fortnight to get to it, because a woman like that would take a fortnight. It was told with something that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite pity. It was told, chiefly, with relief, because it explained everything, and it required nobody living to have done anything, and by Monday it had that smoothness a story gets when it has been passed through 40 hands. Inspector Slack believed it before the post-mortem, and said so in a room at the Bell with the door open. What he did not believe was Ambrose Verrall. Because there was the quarrel at the Bell, in front of 11 people, 4 days before, and there was the business of the Wednesday night, when the constable had gone up at 11:30 on a complaint of a light, and had found Ambrose Verrall standing in the ruined end of the white border with a hurricane lamp and a spade, and 18 inches down, and nothing whatever to say. He had said nothing then, and he said nothing on the Monday, in a manner that made every hour of it worse. And there was Honoria Ledgard, who had been driven back from Wells on the Saturday evening, and had seen a man in the lane by Wren's Peace at 9 o'clock, in a dark waistcoat and no jacket. She told it to Slack on the Monday morning in the voice that had never once gone up, and it was the most damaging 4 sentences anybody said that week. Miss Marple waited until the afternoon. They were on the terrace with the tea things and the lamp not yet lit. Honoria, she said, what colour was the waistcoat? Dark. Dark. Jane, I have known Ambrose Verrall for 30 years. I know the shape of the man. You knew the shape of a man in a lane at 9 o'clock in the evening in the last week of August. Miss Marple set her cup down. You have been judging flocks by the smell of it for 2 seasons, and you were wrong about the Mia Ruiz in front of the woman who had grown it, and she was too well bred to say anything, and so was I, and I have been ashamed of that for a fortnight." The silence went on for a considerable time. "You will have to tell him," said Miss Marple. "Yes," said Honoria Ledgard. She did it the next morning, and did it thoroughly, and Slack took it very badly indeed. And it was that same afternoon that the other thing came in from Taunton, where a constable had been round the dealers, as a matter of routine, and had found, in a tray of oddments in a shop off Bridge Street, a silver cigarette case bought over the counter for £2.10 from a young man who had given a false name and his own bicycle. It was engraved on the inside of the lid, SP, from the staff of the Gaumont, 1922. Percy Tapp cried in the police room at Wells, and admitted the theft and the sale and the 4 rounds at the bell, and went on saying, over and over, that he had only picked it out of the dirt, that it was in the dirt, that it wasn't off the man. It had been in the dirt 11 days before the tree came out. He had been putting a stake in for the Rambler at the end of the border, on the Thursday, and had brought it up on the end of his spade, and had wiped it on his trousers, and had not told anybody, because a man does not tell anybody a thing like that. And he had gone into Chard the following morning and settled with the bicycle shop, which meant that the ground had already been opened, and something had already come out of it, and Dorothea Ilsley had come into the kitchen at Wren's Peace that same Thursday, and told Miss Marple, with her hands folded quite still on the table, that the apple was dead and would have to come out. The house was not sealed. There was nothing to seal it for. There had been no crime committed at Wren's Peace in 1955 that anybody was prepared to write down. The key was with Mrs. Kingswell, because the key had been with Mrs. Kingswell for 11 years, and on the Wednesday morning she let herself in to do the milk and the windows, because nobody had told her not to, and because she could not have borne to be told. Miss Marple went with her. It was cooler than the lane. The border smell came in through the open window, hot and heavy and going over now, and there was the dresser, and the certificate askew in its black frame, and the jar of raffia, and the seed catalogues squared off at the corners. Mrs. Kingswell stood in the middle of the flags with her hat still on. "It ain't right," she said. "No, it ain't right in here." She did not move. "I've done this kitchen twice a week 11 year, and it ain't right, and I can't tell you what it is, and I've laid awake." Miss Marple did not help her. It was the one thing she had learned earliest and used most, and it cost her more than people supposed. Mrs. Kingswell said the tea things had been put away. Mrs. Kingswell said the range had been let out, but that was natural, that was August. Mrs. Kingswell said there'd been no bread in and there'd never been no bread in. She got it Tuesdays. She said the window catch. She said the mat. She came back 3 times to the sink and went off it again. And the 3rd time she said the tap wanted a washer and had wanted one since June, and Miss Ilsley wouldn't have a man in for it. And then she said her board were empty. Her board. That board. Mrs. Kingswell pointed at the little slatted wooden board beside the sink, bare, scrubbed pale. There's always summat on it face down. Always. Her cup, her jug, her spoon, whatever she'd had last, rinsed and turned over on that board, and I've come in Monday mornings 11 year, and took it off of there and put it away, and I never once come in and found that board bare. She stopped. Her chin had gone, and the glass were on the table. Miss Marple looked at the table. It was a plain scrubbed deal table, and there was nothing on it now, and there had been a small glass on it on the Sunday morning, with an inch in the bottom, upright, sitting in the middle of a table that had been wiped, next to a decanter, with the stopper out. "She never left a thing standing," said Mrs. Kingswell. "Not a thing. Not in her own house, nor nobody else's. She'd rinse a cup out in a house where the woman were dying in the next room. It were her way. It were the way they were all learned." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It was." She went to the dresser then, because she had come for the dresser, and she moved the jar of raffia 2 inches to the left. Underneath it, where it had been put down and something had been stood on it to stop it blowing about in the draught from the door, was the Lincolnshire catalogue, with the order form gone from the back of it, and the pink counterfoil of a postal order for £1.14 6, dated the 2nd of August, and folded inside the catalogue, on a sheet of ruled paper torn out of an exercise book, a plan of the front of the border in pencil, 12 feet of it drawn to a scale, with the buttress marked and the door in the wall marked. 200 bulbs set out in groups of 11 and 13 and 9, with the depths written against them in a small upright hand, and at the top of the sheet, underlined once, April 1956. Miss Marple stood with it in both hands for rather a long time. A woman may do a great many things when the ground has given her up. She may go out to the shed and take the cap off the tin, and there is nothing in the world to say she may not. But a woman does not sit at her own kitchen table on the 2nd of August and lay out 200 tulips in groups of 11 and 13 and 9, and write the depths against them, and pay £1 14 and 6 that she has called robbery, for a spring she does not intend to see, and she does not leave a glass standing on a table she has wiped. "Ivy," said Miss Marple. "On the Saturday, who came to this house?" Mrs. Kingswell wiped her face with the flat of her hand, and thought about it, and then said that nobody came to this house. That was the whole of it. That was what she'd always said about her. Nobody come to the gate. Nobody at all? Only the telegram, said Mrs. Kingswell. Nobody had thought anything about the telegram, because it had been seen. 3 people had seen it, and each of them had told the police, unprompted, as the sort of small, useless thing one tells the police to show willing. Mrs. Pike, going up the charred road at about 9:15 on the Saturday evening, with the buff envelope in her hand, in her coat despite the heat, walking quickly, the way she always walked when it was a wire, because a wire in a village is either a death or a birth, and there is no third thing. She had knocked and gone in, and been perhaps 4 minutes, and come out and gone back down. Everyone knew it, everyone had known it within an hour. It had been the last ordinary fact of Dorothea Ilsley's life, and it had been folded into the story without anybody once turning it over, and Miss Marple, standing in the office at Wells on the Thursday afternoon, with her gloves in her hand, understood exactly why. Because a telegram is not a visitor. It is a piece of weather, nobody counts it. The counterfoil book was numbered. The clerk at Wells was helpful in the manner of a man who has nothing better to do and a stranger to do it for. Every wire delivered out of a sub-office was entered and receipted, and the counterfoil retained, and the county copy was filed at Wells against the office copy, and there had been a wire to Nether Bewley on the Saturday the 19th, one, timed at 4:51 in the afternoon, and addressed to the Bassets about a heifer. Nothing at 9:15. Nothing to Wren's Peace. Nothing to Dorothea Ilsley at any hour of that day, or the day before it, or the day after. There was an entry in the Nether Bewley office book, in a neat, upright hand, D. Ilsley, Wren's Peace, 9:15 p.m., and there was no counterfoil, because the counterfoil went with the wire, and there had been no wire. She had written herself into a book to account for being seen. Miss Marple stood in the cool of the Wells office for some moments looking at nothing in particular, and then thanked the clerk, and asked him for the times of the bus, and went out into the glare of Sadler Street, and did not go directly to the bus. The solicitors were Hallam and Prue, and their outer room smelled of dust and floor polish, and had a clock in it that was fast. The young man behind the counter was perfectly willing to say what could be said, and nothing that could not. And what could be said was this, that Miss Dorothea Ilsley had written to them on the Wednesday the 16th, requesting an appointment, that the appointment had been given for 11 o'clock on Monday the 21st, and that she had not attended, and they had been informed of the reason on the Tuesday. She said what it concerned? She said she wished to make a statement in the presence of a solicitor, said the young man, and to have it witnessed and kept. She was rather particular about the kept. He turned the letter-book round briefly and turned it back. Mr. Prue said she'd have been better going straight to the police, and Mr. Hallam said people don't. They come here first, they always have. Did she say to whom she had spoken? Not to us. 2 days, Miss Marple thought, sitting upstairs on the bus with the fields going past the colour of a paper bag. 2 days between the letter and the quarrel in the Bell. 5 between the letter and the Saturday. She had told somebody. A woman of that kind does not write to a solicitor in secret and then go quietly to her chair. She had put her affairs in order, and putting one's affairs in order means telling the people who will be inconvenienced. And she had gone into the Bell to tell Ambrose Verrall, in front of 11 witnesses, that she knew what was not in her garden. And she had gone into the post office on the Monday for a postal order for 4 and 6 that she did not need, and stood at the counter, and neither woman had said one word about the thing that the whole of Somerset was talking about. There is a silence that means two people have nothing to say to each other. There is another kind. She got down at the pump at 6 and the queue was forming, and she went into the post office at 4 minutes past, and Mrs. Pike was putting up the shutter on the savings window. "Miss Jane Marple." "Mrs. Pike, I wonder whether I might see the Canadian letters." Mrs. Pike straightened the shutter and turned round, and her face was perfectly pleasant. "There's nothing I'd like better than to oblige you," she said, "and I can't. A letter's the property of the person it's addressed to. It always has been. It's not mine to show, and it wouldn't be mine to show if the police asked me, and they have." The Reverend Aubrey Nance opened the notebook on the Wednesday morning and read out one line and would not let her hold it. It was a small locked book, his predecessor's, in a hand that sloped hard, and the entry was dated the 9th of August, 1925. "SP asked me this morning what I thought a photograph was worth. I said nothing was worth what it cost him to ask. He laughed and said I was in the wrong trade. There is nothing else," said Nance. "I have been through the whole of that summer 4 times. That is the only line in which he appears, and he appears in it once, and then the parish goes on about the harvest." "It is enough," said Miss Marple. "It is not evidence." "No," she agreed. "It is a shape." She walked down to the post office at 10 minutes to 1, which is the worst part of the day in a drought, when the shadows are directly under things, and there was nobody in the shop. Mrs. Pike was writing up the office book with the pen held very upright. "Mrs. Pike, I am going to be a nuisance. You'll not be the first today. I wish to send a wire to Canada." Miss Marple put her bag on the counter and began the business of getting her glasses out of it, which took some little time. "It is for the Registrar General of the Province of Ontario, and I cannot manage the capitals. My hand is not what it was, and they will only make me do it again if it is not clear. I wonder if you would be so very kind." Mrs. Pike took a form and squared it in front of her, and unscrewed the cap of the pen. "Registrar General," she said. "Province of Ontario. Yes. Then, require record of death Alice Verrall." The pen stopped and started again, and wrote it. "Formerly of Nether Bewley, Somerset, England, between 1936 and 1940. Have you got the years? 1936 and 1940. "I've got them. And I should like it to go at the cheaper rate, so it will not be off until the Wednesday," said Miss Marple, and spelled it, slowly, all of it, the way it had been written on a postcard in 1925, by a girl who had never once been told otherwise. The shop was extremely quiet. Somewhere at the back the van man was moving something. Mrs. Verena Pike sat with the pen resting on the paper. She had written 11 words. She did not look up, and she did not look at the door, and what was on her face was not fear at all. It was the expression of a woman doing an arithmetic she has done before, and getting, this time, a different answer. "You'll send it whether I write it or not," she said. "I shall send it from Wells this afternoon," said Miss Marple. It was never going to matter who wrote it down. No. Mrs. Pike put the cap back on the pen and screwed it, and set it in the tray, square to the edge, next to the others. She died in the February. 1938. There was a letter come from the almoner at the hospital, and I stood where I'm sat now with it in my hand, and there was Mrs. Coles waiting for a 2-shilling stamp, and I put it in my apron. "And in the spring you wrote to Ambrose Verrall." "I wrote a very good letter," said Mrs. Pike. "It took 4 hours." Slack, who had come up from the Bell and had been standing in the lane since 12:30 with 2 men and no idea whatever of what he was standing there for, arrested her at 1:20 for the murder of Dorothea Ilsley, and what she talked about, from 1:20 until nearly 6, with a kind of terrible relief, was not the glass and not the tin and not the walk up the charred road in her coat. It was the letters, the paper. She had bought a quire of the Canadian sort in Bristol in 1939 and made it last. The nibs, the way she had taught herself to write the hand tired, a little at a time, year on year, because a woman of 50 does not write as she wrote at 30, and it had begun to look wrong. 17 years, £90 a year out of a Verrall aunt's trust, receipted and countersigned, and a niece put through her teacher training on it, and a new counter, and a stone for her mother at Chard. She had never once thought of herself as a thief. She had thought of herself as a woman, keeping something going. And she said, twice, and both times as though it were the answer to something, nobody was worse off. It rained on the 11th of October, properly, for 2 days, and the brook came down brown and loud, and the whole village went out to look at it. Miss Marple came back for the sale, which was on the Thursday, though she did not go into the house. Wren's piece went to people from Yeovil with a boy of 6, and the first thing they did, quite reasonably, was to have the whole of the south front grassed over for him to play on, and there was some feeling in the village about that, and it did not last long. Nobody was ever charged with anything to do with Sidney Prawl. There was nobody to charge. The county's view, which went into the papers and then into the village, and will be there when everyone now living is dead, was that Dorothea Ilsley had killed a blackmailer in 1925 and buried him and grown a garden on him for 30 years, and that Verena Pike had killed her to keep a fraud alive. And the first half of that is very likely true, and cannot be shown, and Miss Marple said what she thought of it once, to Honoria, on the terrace, and never again. She was there, she said. Alice was in that house that August. She was the district nurse, and she took the girl in, and there was a reason to take her in. I think Alice struck him, and I think Dorothea buried him, and I think the boat was Dorothea's doing, and the letter Ambrose read out in the bell was Dorothea's doing, and I think she spent 30 years tending the only grave the man was ever going to get. But believing is not knowing, Honoria. I have been wrong about a woman in that house once already this summer. Honoria Ledgard, who had ordered stronger spectacles in September and had told the association she would not judge in 1956, said that she supposed that was so, and they talked about something else, and they were careful with each other for a long while afterwards, and never quite got back what had been there in the car on the Shard Road in August. Ambrose Verrall was told about his sister at the counter of a post office that was shut by a policeman on a Tuesday, 17 years late. He was treated with more gentleness after that than he had been treated with in his life. He did not tell anybody why she had gone, and Miss Marple, who had seen the shape of it from about the second week, and had no more evidence for it than she had for the rest, did not tell anybody either. There are things that are not hers to spend. Alice Verrall's grave is in Ontario. Nobody has been. The tulips came in the 3rd week of October, addressed to a dead woman, £1.14 and 6 paid, small as she had said they would be. The Yeovil people did not want them. Ivy Kingswell took the box away on the bus, and put them in along the foot of the churchyard wall on the south side, in groups of 11 and 13 and 9, at the depths written against them in a small upright hand, on a sheet of ruled paper she could not read a word of. They came up in April and they were very good, and they have been good every year since, and nobody in Nether Bewley knows why they are there.